Single person in this room has read and memorized the United Nations Charter. If you haven't, you should do it, especially if you're going to be a student here at Georgetown. The United Nations was designed to prevent another war, but it was also designed to promote social progress and better standards of life. If you look at the preamble to the Charter, they proclaim that. These founders who assembled in San Francisco proclaimed that as a major goal of the organization. The organization has struggled in promoting social progress. More recently, the United Nations has been reinvigorated with the development of the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. The purpose of this gathering is to look at the SDGs and think about how they can move forward, what role diplomacy must play in promoting the SDGs. The UN was founded in 1945. Georgetown University was founded in 1789. The purpose of Georgetown was to be a global institution, was to promote better world understanding. The first course catalogs were published in English, French, and Spanish, symbolizing this global institution. So what better place than Georgetown to think about how we can promote better standards of life and social progress through the SDGs. So on behalf of all of us here, on behalf of President Jack DeGioia, I want to welcome you to Georgetown and invite you to engage and ask yourself this question: how can you make the world better? So welcome and thank you.
So let me welcome you here on behalf of UNA-NCA, and thank you for joining us in celebrating the second anniversary of the adoption of the Global Goals for Sustainable Development. First, I would like to say thank you to our speakers and panelists, to Georgetown University and the Healy Family Student Center for hosting and partnering with UNA-NCA, to the Sustainable Development Committee, led by Patrick Realiza. Patrick, are you here? To Nexus Media for live streaming the forum, and to our staff and volunteers who make such events possible. UNA-NCA is one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the United States of America, with over 1,200 members serving the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. Our mission is to educate and mobilize Americans for a strong US-UN partnership. We do so through program committees covering issues such as sustainable development, human rights, international law, and peace and security, as well as a very active group of young professionals and students, and a year-round Model UN program engaging middle and high school students in our area. If you're not yet a member, I strongly encourage you to join UNA-NCA and become a strong voice in our community. There are many opportunities to get involved in our work, and students up to age 25 can join free as part of our Gen UN program. Before we move on to the rest of the program, I would like to let you know about some exciting events we have coming up in the next few months. First off, on Saturday, October 14th, is the Young Professional Career Dinner, which will feature keynote speaker Andy Rabins, the Special Advisor for Global Youth Issues at the U.S. Department of State. This event will have special dinners hosted and focused on different topics, such as careers in the UN, careers in global health, technology, human rights, and the global goals. Next is the UN Day event in late October, which will feature the UN Undersecretary General for Global Communications. And finally, on December 7th, our annual Human Rights Award reception, which we are very excited to announce will be featuring United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al-Hussein. Make sure to check out our website to learn more. You can also find me after the event if you have questions about events, membership, or ways to get involved in UNA-NCA. With that, I would like to welcome Thomas Liu, a member of our Sustainable Development Committee and integral planner of this event today. He will talk to you more about the work of the committee and introduce you to the schedule of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for your introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Liu, and I'm a proud member of the UNA-NCA Sustainable Development Committee, and I'm also a senior at Langley High School, which is located across the river in McLean, Virginia. And on behalf of the Sustainable Development Committee and the rest of the UNA-NCA chapter, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's special event, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Diplomatic Perspectives. We're delighted to have everyone here today, despite it being a Monday morning where everyone's likes to stay on their bed a little longer. And as a reminder, we're also broadcasting today's event through Nexus Media Live and with the hashtag Act for SDGs, which is this year's hashtag in the United Nations. After joining UNA-NCA as its only high school member more than a year ago, I quickly realized that our organization carries out an important mission, advocating for the UN SDGs, also known as the Global Goals. And with that in mind, I conceptualized this event with the goal of furthering the public's understanding of the SDGs. 2 years ago today, on September 25th, 2015, world leaders formally adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes 17 global goals and its 169 targets. On this morning, we're gathered here today to commemorate the second anniversary of the adoption of the SDGs and to hear from a wide variety of speakers. Today, we're really honored to host 5 distinguished diplomats from countries which includes Afghanistan, Barbados, Costa Rica, Finland, and Sweden, for the speakers to engage with us through 2 interactive panels moderated by Georgetown's own Professor Mark Giordano and Mr. Ed Elmendorf, who is the former president of both UNA-NCA and UNA-USA, and for them to discuss the progress and the continued challenges of the SDG implementation in their respective nations. So the goal of today's event is for us to learn from the success of these nations and to try to bring their success back here locally to the DC area. And we're also delighted to host Mr. Tony Pipa, who is this special coordinator for the post-2015 development agenda under the Obama administration, here today to deliver the opening keynote. Mr. Pipa will provide his unique insight and telling us where are we now in regards to the U.S. progress towards the attainment of the UN SDGs. Mr. Pipa is currently a senior fellow of global economy and development at the Brookings Institution, where he studies the efforts to realize the universality of the SDGs. With that, it's my great honor to welcome Mr. Pipa up to the stage.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Professor Arend. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today and the invitation, both from the United Nations Association of National Capital Area, and Georgetown for hosting this morning. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to share my reflections on the SDGs with all of you, and especially with my ambassadorial counterparts who will be participating afterwards as well. So it was 2 years ago that I joined you just after then President Obama addressed his counterparts at the United Nations. And in what I consider to be a set of really inspirational remarks that laid out a path for peace, dignity, and prosperity in the world, he committed the United States to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, back then, I described it as a politically optimistic moment for the globe. And the SDGs had just come out of a process that the Secretary General called the most inclusive and transparent in history. They were embraced in a consensus by all 193 member states. They built on an innovative financing agreement that had been agreed just a couple months prior. And then they anticipated what was a transformative climate agreement agreed to in Paris just a couple months later. So together, if you take these 3 agreements, they really represented, from the development perspective, an apex of global cooperation. They seemed to fulfill some of the promise of what is possible in the multilateral system when countries come together, when they recognize global interests that are in their national interests, and they find common ground to solve problems together. But it was just a promise. It was only the setting of the goals. And 2 years later, much has changed. There's been a transition at the United Nations, new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. If you haven't noticed, there's been a presidential transition in the United States, with a president and an administration really that's emphasizing national interests above all else, and has already pulled the United States from that aforementioned Paris Agreement. So given the current political environment and the uncertainty surrounding global cooperation, it's very fair to ask of the SDGs now in 2017, where are we now? So first, let's look at the positive. One, I believe the SDGs have become the DNA of development for the global community. I just spent last week in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. We had heads of state, CEOs, philanthropists, celebrities, all converging to discuss global problems and talk about global solutions. These colorful SDG icons were ubiquitous. And you can get a sense from going to the different events and meetings that they are deeply penetrating into the consciousness of at least global decision makers and activists as the framework for what progress is needed and what's possible on sustainable development. So at events hosted by Concordia, World Economic Forum, Michael Bloomberg, Bill and Melinda Gates, TED, the TED Talks, the School Foundation, the United Nations Foundation. At every turn, you saw the goals, you heard about the goals, you said which goals you were contributing to. And it's not just the UN and the General Assembly. Advancing the Sustainable Development Agenda was a major theme at Davos this year. Alignment against the SDGs is now part of the Global Impact Investing Network's annual Impact Investor Survey. You can see it starting to be integrated across many different dimensions and many different sectors. But secondly, not only have they become our DNA, I think the SDGs have made data sexy. So what was once the dry technical domain of statistical offices and evaluation specialists is now seen as core to the business model of achieving global progress. And so if you haven't yet, I encourage you to check out the goalkeepers charts that the University of Washington published with the Lancet, supported by Bill and Melinda Gates. They're just one demonstration of the way champions are using the power of data to mobilize action. They chart out specific indicators on each of the first 6 goals and show what progress could look like if we continue on current trends, what progress might be realized with additional focused attention, and if we come off the track, where we might end up. There are initiatives to map geospatial data, to disaggregate data so that we can ensure we are measuring impacts on women apart from men, or drill down to the youth, elderly, disabled. There are initiatives to address data gaps in conflict-affected areas. So at the beginning of the SDGs and in creating the SDGs, there was a call for a data revolution. And while I don't think we're in full-blown revolution yet, I think the SDGs have certainly inspired a set of serious revolutionaries who are doing their level best to get it started. Third, the SDGs have proved to be ecumenical. They're not just for governments anymore. Businesses have embraced the SDGs with fervor, and they're eagerly seeking ways to use the SDGs as a platform to do good while giving themselves a competitive advantage. So this is not just corporate social responsibility. This is a recognition that there are business commercial interests that overlap with development needs. So you have financiers from Citi and MasterCard to impact investors looking for ways to unleash the estimated $1.5 trillion annually that might be needed to achieve the goals. Philanthropy, which took little notice of the Millennium Development Goals and really maybe made a cursory attempt to align against them, has already created multiple platforms to align with the SDGs, including the online SDG Philanthropy Platform, which is providing excellent data visualizations that show how U.S. philanthropy's investments are contributing to SDG progress. You have a philanthropy platform through the OECD, helping organize European philanthropy and philanthropy in the South against how they align on the goals. And an important element of this all-hands-on-deck approach has been the leadership of subnational governments. The SDGs are helping us prove that local is the new global. The government of Valencia in Spain has organized an alliance of cities and NGOs to contribute to Spain's progress. The National Confederation of Municipalities of Brazil has an initiative underway. And even in the US, cities like Baltimore, San Jose, Minneapolis, and Little Rock are looking at how the SDGs can promote progress for their citizens. They can recognize initiatives here local to even Georgetown about how students and faculty and administration are making progress that can contribute and aggregate up globally to the global goals. So these are all positive signs. But we have 13 years left in a very ambitious agenda. And swimming as we are in such uncertain and divisive political currents, it begs the question, will we get there? And are we on track to achieve the SDGs? From one person's personal assessment, I would say not yet. Looking at the breadth and the scope of the SDGs, they really require exponential and not incremental progress. And on the positive side, you've seen continued attention and progress on former areas that were part of the Millennium Development Goals, areas like maternal and child health. Well, there's been a lot of traction and a lot of governments with businesses coming together to continue to move forward progress. And there's also been some traction on even some of the new areas of the SDGs that are potentially transformative, like legal identity and child and birth registration. But I think there are many more worrying signs. And one reason is because we are leaving behind the leaving no one behind agenda. Stakeholders have not yet fully embraced and recognized how different it would be to leave no one behind. And when I say that, I mean, when you look at the SDGs, they really commit us not to relative improvement on some scales of human development, but to ending things. So ending extreme poverty, ending preventable child deaths, ending preventable maternal mortality, ending hunger worldwide. This requires specific focus and specific attention on those who are hardest to reach. And I don't believe we've really fully embraced that in the plans that we're making to try to achieve the SDGs. And I think the data doesn't lie. If you look at the current rates of progress, extreme poverty will decrease from 9% worldwide to 6% by 2030. That's substantial progress. That would mean hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, but it does not mean an end to extreme poverty, which is really the moral center of the SDGs. On the current trajectories, we would end stunting worldwide by 2080, not by 2030. And it's the poorest 20% of the world who account for almost half of the world's cases for stunting. Global hunger is actually on the rise, with 38 million more people going hungry than last year. And that's primarily due to conflict, which highlights just how much we are lagging on one of the most critically important new pieces of the agenda, and that's Goal 16, around issues of peace, security, rule of law, and government's responsiveness to their citizens. Not to mention that the US pullout from Paris jeopardizes the world's ability to reach Goal 13 on climate. You have a tough mix right there of the last mile and the difficulty of achieving the last mile that the SDGs really challenge us to do, and to do it simultaneously on multiple different dimensions. Which leads to a second reflection, and that I think there's been a very limited embrace of universality. What do I mean by universality? So the SDGs were revolutionary in committing all countries to their application, no matter their level of development. So the SDGs are for the US and for Germany and for France, as well as they are for developing countries. They're for middle-income countries, high-income countries, low-income countries. Meant to be applied everywhere. And OECD governments have a specific dual responsibility, one on achieving SDGs within their own borders, and then accelerating global progress through aid and investments in other countries. I think it's fair to say that almost every OECD government is still struggling to find its footing on how to do that. And I think it's interesting because I think it's one of the most revolutionary aspects of this particular agenda, because it's potentially the basis for solidarity across many non-traditional lines It breaks down the traditional dichotomy that we think of when we think of high income, low income, developing countries. So I think Germany is probably furthest ahead with a country sustainable development plan and then clear lines of responsibility amongst its domestic agencies for achieving that, while at the same time increasing its official development assistance to now become the world's second largest bilateral donor, following the US. But it's not just governments that have had trouble, I think, embracing universality. It's also those other actors I talked about that have actually come to the table excited about the SDGs. Businesses, philanthropies, universities. They're all sometimes guilty of this. When I hear businesses talk about the embrace of the SDGs, for example, they are almost speaking about their engaging in emerging markets or in a global context. There's two exceptions I see from the US, and that's really Citi and Merck with their initiatives, and we can talk about them later, but with their initiatives doing work both in the US and globally. But even Bill Gates and Goalkeepers focused exclusively on their international investments, even though as a foundation they've invested heavily in education in the United States and launched a partnership on economic mobility here in the US, recognizing how difficult and actually how much the US has regressed in terms of providing paths out of poverty for its citizens. So I saw very few glimmers of the challenges in connecting what happens in developing countries and all the attention that I saw lavished on the SDGs in New York. And I think if we're actually going to be successful, we're going to have to become much more intentional about that. And so while the SDGs have become the DNA for global development, I don't think universality has truly become yet the DNA of the SDGs. And then a third reason. I think at this point, integration is more rhetoric than reality. And so what do I mean by integration? The SDGs are truly a platform. They are not a set of very siloed specific goals, even though they're 17. What they really do is highlight the interdependence of multiple dimensions of development, and they ask stakeholders to drive progress on them simultaneously, or at least to make progress on one or two without falling back on other different dimensions. So you can think of, for example, the rise out of extreme poverty over the 20 years previous to the SDGs, where you had exceptional economic growth in countries like China, India, that brought huge amounts of people out of poverty. But at the same time, created complications for our natural resources and our environment. The SDGs ask us to make progress on those different dimensions at once and simultaneously, or at least not to regress on one while we're making progress on the other. We're still fairly siloed when it comes to our solutions. And actually, I think it's no more apparent than in the continued parallel efforts around climate and development. I don't think we've really integrated what we're doing around climate and development. This will begin to change as the global community has to deal more and more with adaptation and help communities figure out what they will do because of rising sea levels, for example, or because of increased disasters in scale and scope. Then that's going to bring up issues related to poverty, health, jobs, governance, social cohesion, and safety nets. And it will provide, I think, a very stark and heated attention on the city's goal. But for the SDGs to be successful, we have to get much better at recognizing and exploiting the connection between those. Which I think brings us to the United States. And I'll just sort of end my remarks with a reflection on where we are in the US. So certainly the US federal government is absent where it relates to the SDGs. I would term it as more benign neglect versus active rejection or resistance. But we certainly heard no mention of the SDGs in the President's speech at the UN General Assembly. But I think even more telling is you don't hear much about it either from Ambassador Haley. Nor even from Ambassador Mark Green, who's now the new administrator at USAID. So the SDGs are certainly the platform by which the countries in which we're investing in overseas see their own plans and progress reflected. And yet it's not something that we are using as a way to think about our own investments and to support that particular progress. On the other hand, that provides opportunities for leadership from other sectors. And I do think we've seen businesses step up to the plate. We've seen states and cities become more active in looking at the SDGs and adopting them. In addition to the cities I talked about earlier, you even have the state of California, for example, looking to align where it's going against the SDGs. I think there's a major opportunity in the US for those actors to raise awareness of what the SDGs could mean to the US. In fact, I think we're missing an opportunity, even with this administration's priorities, to look at how goal setting and what's inside the SDGs is really relevant. When you think of job creation, when you think of inequality, and one of the targets within the SDGs is to have incomes for the lower 40% rise faster than the rest of the nation. When you look at health and health benefits and you think of the opioid crisis that we're facing in the United States, I think there's a lot actually that actively can be related to and is reflective of what we're dealing with in the US. And so we're missing an opportunity if we're not raising awareness and sort of setting those goals and pursuing them. I think one of the major opportunities we have in the US is there has been a great deal of leadership shown by others in reaction to the pullout from Paris. And you have Governor Brown and former Mayor Bloomberg going to host a climate summit in California in a year. I think we should take that opportunity to start talking about the other dimensions that can be integrated when we think about making progress on climate. How can we use that opportunity to talk about the jobs that we can create through that, through the efforts that folks are leading? How can we talk about the health benefits? How can we talk about the ways in which we address inequality as we're building that new economy and going forward to continue to make progress on the goals that the Paris Agreement set out for us as a nation? So I would just end to remember that while we might not have federal leadership in the immediate term on the SDGs, and I don't think it's something that will ultimately be embraced by this administration, there is still progress to be made, and there's still a lot of activity that can happen to create that. This is a now 13-year agenda. There are 3 more presidential elections in the United States before the end of that agenda. And if you recall, during the Millennium Development Goals, the United States actually did not embrace, as a government, with its leadership, the Millennium Development Goals for probably the first 8 years of its time. But I think was a major actor in helping drive progress towards the goals when it did come to embrace them. So I think we can create an environment in which that occurs again for the SDGs. This is a long game, and I think we're all in it together to play it. Thanks very much. Time for questions, or what are we doing? And who wants to challenge me on some of the things I said? I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Do we? Yeah?
So who's going to?
So if you have a question, raise your hand.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned Merck and Citi, and you expand on that a little bit? I'm just sort of curious.
So for example, Merck has an initiative called Merck for Mothers, where they're focused on maternal mortality. They are investing in Southeast US and other areas where actually maternal mortality is at the level of where you might see it in some developing countries. Citi has a financial inclusion initiative in which it's trying to bring people who typically wouldn't use formal banking mechanisms into the formal economy. They're focusing just as hard on it in the US as they are overseas. And I don't think they're drawing distinctions. They also are, they've made a $100 million commitment to unleash investment in clean energy and environment. And again, focusing on it in the US as well as overseas.
How do you, corporations do a lot of different things.
Right.
Thousands of public companies. How do you
But they are,
specifically sustainable development goals type activities versus
yes.
what other companies are doing?
So they are actually promoting it as the way in which their commercial interest and which their corporate social responsibility initiatives are overlapping with the goals. And so when they talk about the goals, and they talk about as a corporation where they're helping to contribute to progress on the goals, they'll talk about it both from a US perspective and a developing country perspective. And they'll look specifically, they've looked specifically and gone through a process internally to say, here are the goals that we're trying to make progress on, and here's where we will bring continued focus, attention, and even try to bring other partners around these particular issues and areas. And many companies, that's what I'm saying about businesses embracing the goals. Many companies are doing this. They're going through an internal process at leadership level to say, where does our business model, where do our commercial interests overlap? How do we want to change in behavior internally? And what sort of progress do we want to make externally? And what can we commit to? They're making some commitments. Now they're talking about those commitments publicly. I haven't quite seen, and they are using some reporting platforms just to say, here's what our business operations do. But I haven't seen someone talk about it publicly, then create a dashboard, and then show what their progress is like on that dashboard and hold themselves accountable in that way. I think that's actually probably coming, and there's also a lot of third-party stakeholder platforms that people are trying to develop that would show and measure companies on what their contribution is or isn't actually towards the goals, or where they might actively be constraining progress on the goals as well. Oh, sorry. Last one.
Okay. Ed Almador from the UNA. You spoke about the importance of the inequality agenda, and particularly the poorest 40%, as a new way, a different way of looking at the goals within the United States. And yet, it's that population that also seems to constitute, in many ways, the essential base for President Trump. Can you tell me how to bring these together?
Well, so I'm talking to a lot of colleagues who are working on the domestic side, thinking about how to bring those two together. I do think that, so look, I think there are real opportunities in some of the things I spoke about, like job creation, like health benefits, and I think rather than, I think with this, I'm not sure saying that these are SDGs that were globally agreed upon will be something that creates a lot of resonance among those particular populations. However, being very focused on particular goals that would provide, policy solutions or political attention and political will otherwise to make progress on social issues that are affecting them, I think would have real impact. So think about the opioid crisis. And think about whether the President's Commission on the Opioid Crisis came out with a very specific time-bound goal with commitments from business, state governors, cities, with some policy solutions to make progress on that. That would be a huge contribution, actually, on the US side toward the global goals, but at the same time, I think would affect the lowest 40% that we're talking about. And again, on climate, one of the things that climate is talking about is, yes, the living, breathing air that we have, but it's also talking about new economies and bringing jobs and new business creation around that. And if we can do that and do it in the areas, I think the difficulty also in the U.S. is sort of the geographic difficulties we have to mapping where we might be able to do some of those things and getting the policy levers to be in those places. I think we would make enormous progress for the U.S.'s own achievement of the goals by the end of the 15 years. I mean, I think there will have to be non-traditional coalitions that occur, whether or not it's the SDGs for where we are as a country and some of the social issues that we're dealing with as a country. I think we've tended to see divisive politics as a way to try to make progress on those. I think over time you'll probably see some ways to try to bridge those divides and look for ways in which we can solve problems together. And I think the SDGs actually offer us a potential platform to start that conversation. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Whatever. Thank you very much. My name is Albert Zhu. I'm the Director of Academic Programming of the Georgetown International Relations Club. I want to thank you all for coming and thank the UNA for the opportunity to co-sponsor this event. I want to just get our first panel of the morning started, which will be on progress and monitoring achievement of the SDGs. So please join me in welcoming Professor Giordano of the School of Foreign Service, Ambassador of Barbados to the United States, Ambassador Hart, and Ambassador of Costa Rica to the United States, Ambassador Hayes.
Good morning, everyone. I would again like to thank the United Nations Association, DC Capital Area, and the Georgetown International Relations Club for co-hosting this event. My name is Mark Giordano. I'm a professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and it's my distinct pleasure this morning to welcome two ambassadors to have a discussion on the SDGs. So Ambassador Hart from Barbados and Ambassador Macaya from Costa Rica. You have their bios either in the folders you have with you, or if you're watching online, you can look them up easily enough. So I don't want to go into detail there, but what I do want to do is mention two specific things, or one specific thing about each of them that maybe sets them apart and has a relevance for us this morning that we might want to dive into a little more with our questions. Ambassador Hart was the chief negotiator for Barbados for climate change. And Ambassador Macaya is perhaps the only sitting ambassador to the United States who is a scientist. I don't know if there's statistics on this, but if he's not the only one, he's one of very, very, very few. So what we're going to do this morning is have them first make a few minutes of comments on progress from their perspective on the SDGs. We'll have a little bit of question and answer up here, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for your questions. So let me first turn it over to Ambassador Hart.
Thank you so much. And first, let me thank you, Mr. Moderator, as well as the organizers of this excellent event, and also my colleague and friend, the distinguished ambassador of Costa Rica. You mentioned our differences, but there's so many similarities between Barbados and Costa Rica. We're both very small countries in the same region, and countries with a very strong commitment to promoting sustainable development. And despite our small size, we've played really important leadership roles in the international community in promoting not only the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, but sustainable development in general, and at times when it was not popular to do so. The Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are already embedded in the DNA of countries like Barbados. In 1994, Barbados hosted the first global conference on the sustainable development of small island developing states. And from that time, probably even before then, we clearly understood that it was impossible for us to focus just on economic development without taking into account its impact on social development and the environment. So this concept of sustainable development for us represented our development pathway. We had to pursue sustainable development if we were to create a truly inclusive and fast-growing and prosperous society. So we fully back the negotiations that resulted in the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In my view, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development represents the international community's best efforts to operationalize the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. And the reason why I say this is that it is quite clear. The framers of the Charter over 70 years ago clearly recognized that peace and security, human rights, and development were interrelated and mutually interdependent. So it was therefore impossible for humanity to be secure in a state of underdevelopment, and that humanity could not enjoy development and peace and security without the full enjoyment of human rights. And when one looks at the comprehensive nature of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, one sees this comprehensive approach to promoting peace and prosperity reflected in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It also reflects a new people-centered approach to development and reflects our collective urgency and ambition to transform the global economy and also global societies. Recognizing, of course, that each country, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that each country has responsibility for its own development. And one of the questions that was posed to us as part of this opening stance is what do we see as issues that would either hinder or support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals? And I wish to identify three. First prerequisite for successful implementation of the SDGs is maintenance of the multilateral rules-based system. We heard many of the speeches at the UN General Assembly, and it is quite clear that this multilateral rules-based system is under threat. It has worked pretty well over the course of the last 70 years, where we have clear rules of the road on finance, trade, security, environmental issues. But we really need, if the SDGs are to be successful, we really need to maintain and strengthen this rules-based multilateral system. It ensures fairness, it ensures transparency, and it ensures predictability in the conduct of global affairs. And these are all essential components for successful implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The second is strengthen international cooperation and partnership. No one country, no matter how powerful, can solve the range of global threats and challenges before us. International cooperation is not a zero-sum game. Global problems demand global solutions. And we've seen it over and over. The Ebola crisis, to matters related to terrorism and security, all require strengthened international cooperation. The third prerequisite for successful implementation of the SDGs is addressing climate change. And I come from a region that is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Just a few days ago, many islands in the Caribbean were ravished by an unprecedented onslaught of hurricanes. In our region, 60% of all citizens live within 1 mile of the coastline, and 90% of all economic activity takes place within that same area. It is estimated that if we don't take the necessary actions to address climate change, we will, in the Caribbean, will on average be affected in the order of 5 to 30% of our GDP from these extreme weather events. It is absolutely essential that the international community sticks to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement represents our best chance of preventing dangerous climate change. Now, these extreme weather events will continue, and we are not alone. For example, in the United States, between 1980 and 2016, there were 208 extreme weather and climate events costing in excess of $1 billion. And we saw the devastation in Puerto Rico, in Houston, and in Florida. So we are really hopeful that we will see a significant change in the approach by some of our partners, because if we don't address climate change in a comprehensive manner, there is no way that we'll be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, the leadership of the United States. The leadership of the United States in 2015, not only around the successful adoption of the Paris of the 2030 agenda under Anthony's stewardship, but around the Paris Agreement. The leadership of the United States was absolutely essential in delivering these two ambitious outcomes. We would never have had such a comprehensive set of goals. You know, I distinctly remember parts of the negotiations when some countries wanted to leave out the peace and security elements of the SDGs. And the US insisted that peace and security and development were intertwined and mutually interdependent. And that's why we have very strong elements around peace and security and also human rights reflected in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. On reflection, it really was a brilliant move. So US leadership is absolutely key if we are to ensure that we move from simply having words on a piece of paper to having an agenda that makes a difference in the lives of people around the world. So those are some of my brief opening comments, and I look forward to some really great questions from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. Ambassador Macaya.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Giordano for that very kind introduction, and Senior Associate Dean Anthony Clark, and all the students and faculty here present for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. I'd also like to recognize the words by Mr. Pipa, who in his initial address framed where we are as a planet and set the tone for this meeting today. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with my colleague and friend, Ambassador Hart from the beautiful country of Barbados. I must say that I feel very close to Georgetown. My wife is now a student here, and she's getting an LLM in the law school. Couldn't join us today because she woke up not feeling very well. But we have 4 kids. They're all in elementary school. We have 2 in elementary, 1 in middle school, and 1 in high school. So I am now the only non-student in the household. We're investing heavily in SDG number 4. But what I'd like to do is to frame where Costa Rica is today, how we got here, And then we can start discussing what we have left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if you look at Costa Rica's history, it almost seems as if we've been working towards the SDGs since the beginning. We are a solid democracy and one of the oldest democracies in Latin America. And very soon after gaining our independence as a nation, we started to invest heavily in education. We made education mandatory, free, and paid for by the state in 1869. And that was for both boys and girls. So if you think of Costa Rica in those years, we were a coffee-growing nation, and essentially what we were saying is the daughter of a peasant on a coffee farm should have access to the same education as the son of the owner of the coffee farm. And that started to get the ball rolling in a very different development track. And you can start placing the SDGs to our policies in our history. If you fast forward to the 1940s, this was a very turbulent time politically in Costa Rica, and led to a major agreement in 1941 between the governing administration at the time, which was sort of center-right, with the Communist Party in the opposition, and the Catholic Church. So think of that three-way negotiation taking place back in 1941. And out of that came what we call our social guarantees. It created the University of Costa Rica, which was essentially free higher education, university education. Once again, furthering that bet on education. It created our labor code, so the 40-hour work week, vacation pay, severance pay, and all of the major labor code items were defined back in 1941. And it also created our national healthcare system, which back then covered workers, and then over 15 administrations was expanded to include workers' families, and then the unemployed, and then the poor, and then legal immigrants, and then even undocumented immigrants if they were pregnant women or children. More recently, it was expanded to include partners of the same sex. And today we have a healthcare system which is very close to universal coverage. This was a major institution in our development. Staying with that decade, a turbulent decade, we have a brief civil war in 1948. It only lasted 40 days, but was very influential, as all civil wars are. But out of that came some decisions that continued that sort of out-of-the-box, unprecedented decision-making. And one of the primary items there was abolishing the Army as a permanent institution in December of 1948. So we became the first country to have no armed forces and invested that money that would go to a military into health and education. We're a country that's been dedicated to renewable energy from many decades ago. Today we generate close to 100% of our electricity from renewable resources. Last year was 98 and some percent. This year we will end at over 99% of our electricity being generated from primarily hydroelectric power, geothermal, wind, biomass, and we're just starting with solar. So it's a success story in that area. And we can go into the reasons as to how this happened when we get to the Q&A, but it's highly renewable and it's available throughout the country. 99.5% of our households have electricity. We've been very committed to environmental matters. We became the first tropical nation to reverse deforestation. Between 1940 and 1987, we had deforested our territory from 75% coverage down to 21% coverage. This started to seriously worry us, and We looked at ways of reversing that. We created our national park system with guidance from the United States. So we sent a delegation to the US to understand how the national park system had come to be and how it was administered in the US. It did something very similar in Costa Rica, very quickly establishing national parks that covered about 25% of our land. And then we did something very innovative in the private sector. We created a system of payments for environmental services to private landowners that would leave their land idle to conservation. The money came from two sources. One was fuel. So we tax fuel, both diesel and gasoline. That money goes into a fund that is distributed to private landowners that leave their land idle to conservation. And a second source of income came from water rights. So the big water users, whether they're bottling plants or even the hydroelectric dams, have to pay a fee for the water that turns their turbines. That money goes into a fund, and that is distributed to landowners that have aquifers in their land. And if they protect the forest around these aquifers, they also get a second payment. And so suddenly, instead of investing or putting money towards agriculture, you could make a living or make money by simply leaving your land idle and participating in conservation. And this had a tremendous effect. Between 1986 and 2012, we went from 21% forest coverage to 52% forest coverage. So we reversed deforestation, and today we are reaping the rewards of that in ecotourism and other non-extractive sources of income. We have an aging population. Costa Rica, back in the 1940s, had a lifespan that was about 8 years less than that of the United States, lifespan at birth. Today it's slightly longer than the average lifespan at birth of US citizens. And as is normal in all countries, the older you get, the longer you can expect to live. You're in a new cohort, a new average, and so your lifespan keeps being pushed out. But in Costa Rica, it is exceptionally disproportional, this increasing lifespan with age, to the point where the cohort of 90-year-olds in Costa Rica has the longest life expectancy on the planet. We don't have the longest life expectancy at birth, but for the 90-year-olds, they can expect to live longer than anyone else on the planet on average. And this is being studied now. We have a blue zone. These are zones where a high percentage of the population lives to be 100 healthily. And there's only 5 blue zones that are recognized as blue zones on the planet. Today, we are a country that is considered middle income, focused on services and high-tech manufacturing, high-precision manufacturing. A lot of people think that our #1 exports are agricultural goods like coffee or bananas, but actually our #1 exports are services. And as far as a physical product, our #1 export is medical devices. So once again, this is the result of a sustained effort in education. Now, when the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed to, Costa Rica was a very enthusiastic participant in this. And it started to frame what we have left to do in order to achieve these 17 very important goals. And back in last year, September of 2016, we convened a multi-party stakeholder meeting. These goals are not going to happen by themselves, and they require more than an all-of-government approach, an all-of-country approach. So there's a high-level council that sort of governs the progress that's being made. On that level, on that high-level council, there are 4 members. There's President Solis, the president of the country, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of the Environment and Energy, and the Minister for Planning and economic policy. And back in September of last year, there was a convened meeting that had multiple stakeholders. All three branches of government were represented, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, organizations of civil society, faith-based organizations. Remember in our history back in 1941, the Catholic Church, a faith-based organization, was part of an agreement, and here is a repeat of that strategy. The public universities, local governments, municipal governments, and the private sector all convened to collectively reaffirm our commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we became the first country to collectively reaffirm in a all-of-country approach the goal of achieving these goals. I'll leave it there so that we can start a dialogue, and I once again appreciate being invited to the panel. Thank you.
So thank you both for those opening comments and setting the stage. Let me start with a question. Our keynote today, we focused on U.S. role in some ways. You've highlighted what each of your countries have done short-term and very long-term towards Sustainable Development Goals even before they were perhaps a concept. Could you reflect on what lessons you have for what has helped your country make progress and how those lessons could be applied in the United States? And that could mean either at the national level or civil society, whatever level you want to think about. Maybe Ambassador Hart?
Thanks. One of the key priorities is to ensure, as the distinguished ambassador said, a whole-of-country approach to implementation. And what we've done in Barbados is quite similar to what was done in Costa Rica, is to ensure that there is political, very clear political leadership exercise. So the Prime Minister of Barbados, he has clearly articulated both to his cabinet and to the entire country the imperative of pursuing the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. He's consistently said that Barbados is more than an economy, it's a society. So he has clearly articulated that this is not, that this is a national priority. So leadership at the highest political levels is absolutely key. Second is ensuring from the government side that you embed implementation and follow-up of the Sustainable Development Goals in already existing processes. So therefore, our national budgetary and planning processes have clearly have taken on board in a fulsome manner the implementation of the SDGs. So while we might have our own national goals, which in some instances are more ambitious than the SDGs, we've embedded across the entire government the notion of the not only the notion, but the Sustainable Development Goals. Another existing process that we've also used to advance implementation of the SDGs is a mechanism that was developed or that came into being in the early 1990s. In the early 1990s, we went through a pretty severe economic crisis. And it is once said, or it has been said that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And out of that crisis emerged the social partnership, which is a tripartite arrangement between government, the unions, and employers, where they sat down in the early 90s when we were going through this severe economic crisis and agreed on the way forward. and subsequent administrations have adopted and continue to use this arrangement called the social partnership to advance broad policy objectives. And our next step is to embed the 2030 agenda within this existing, well-functioning process at the national level. Absolutely key is getting buy-in from all of society. And in democracies like ours, when you have a broad national consensus on issues, where you have businesses, private sector, civil society, faith-based organizations supporting an approach, it pressures government, it pressures the political leaders, no matter how reticent they are on moving forward. It pressures them into taking action. So my advice is to ensure that the sustainable developments are not only a government approach or seen as something being pursued only by the government, but it becomes a whole of society endeavor. And that is a model really, that model has worked successfully in Barbados and also in countries, democracies like Costa Rica. So, thank you.
Well, I would fully agree with Ambassador Hart's appreciation that you have to get buy-in from society. And so the process is very important, is how do you get everyone included in the dialogue and paint the big picture. Costa Rica, in our history, was making decisions not based on a comparative analysis. We didn't have a sort of a table there where we were saying, well, what are other countries doing and how are we doing in X, Y, or Z? It was, our policies were based on aspirations that were there in Costa Rica among our citizens. And it really was irrelevant what was happening around us. It was, what did our society want? And to get that buy-in and to have that big picture in front of what we want, how we want to live, is very important. I would say that there is very strong buy-in for the SDGs in Costa Rica and for climate change and for all of these big issues. And that is something that we have to really take advantage of, is keep that momentum going. And where you want to be, I think, is where the only limitation is money, because that's fungible. It's much more difficult if your limitation is political. You know, if you have really a political divide towards achieving or not achieving certain goals, that is much more difficult to overcome than the economic considerations. And the fact that we have achieved standard of living in Costa Rica while still being a middle-income country. We're not a rich country, but it shows that you can become, essentially renewable in your energy matrix. You can achieve healthcare for everyone. You can achieve education for everyone, even without being a rich country. And a lot of countries have looked at some of the policies that worked in Costa Rica to try to see, okay, well, how would that work in another country? So our countries, as Ambassador Hart mentioned, are small nations, but we have a big message. And if we can demonstrate that something is possible, then it can be tried in much bigger countries. And I think that's the role that we play in this global dialogue.
Let me follow on that with one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. You both throughout have highlighted you're from small countries, and yet I think from your comments, as well as anyone who's familiar with the countries would know, your influence in the world is much greater than the size, the economic size of your countries, the geographic size, the population size. So somehow you've had this influence, though you haven't had the hard power options that a large country like the United States might have. Can you reflect on how you use soft power successfully in the international arena with the UN, or this is a group that we have a lot of students here who are maybe in a situation where if they want to make a change early, they're going to have to use a soft power approach as well. What kind of advice do you have?
Well, it is often said that that there are three general tools to exercise global influence and to promote your interests. One is diplomacy. The other, obviously, is military power, and the other is economic suasion, for want of a better word. For small countries like ours, we only have one option. So we have to be principled, credible, and consistent players in terms of how we exercise our diplomacy. So being principled, credible, and consistent means that at times you have to hold a very hard line on issues, but you must be, as my very first Prime Minister said in his opening address to the United Nations General Assembly in December 1966, when we became a member of the UN a few weeks after becoming independent. He said that Barbados will always be a friend of all and a satellite of none. And in essence, that has captured our approach to foreign policy and how we project ourselves globally. We're friends with everyone. We listen, and we try to find compromise on major issues. In a real sense, small states are the glue to the multilateral system. We depend on multilateralism and a rules-based multilateral system to preserve our security and ensure global prosperity, predictability, transparency, and fairness. That's how we survive as sovereign states. So we do everything we can to promote and preserve multilateralism. It means at times compromising on fundamental issues. The example that I gave to on the SDGs, where there was a very strong push by the US and other countries, including our own as well, to ensure the comprehensive nature of the Sustainable Development Goals to include elements of peace and security and human rights, was strongly resisted by many developing countries who felt that the 2030 agenda should just be focused on narrow developmental issues. And we agreed with the US and other countries that we needed a comprehensive approach to the Sustainable Development Goals. It didn't mean that we agree with them on everything. However, we felt that a consensus on how we approach development in the future was more important than no agreement at all. Similarly, on the Paris Agreement, there was a meeting of the minds across the traditional developed and developing country, big country, small country divide. So, our role, or as small countries, really is to try to preserve multilateralism, promote international cooperation, and wherever we can, try to bring big and small, the big countries together to find global solutions to global problems.
As you mentioned, the size of the country is not necessarily proportional to the message that that country can project. And the climate change agreement that was reached is a perfect example of that. I don't think it's a coincidence that Cristiana Figueres, who led the negotiation to its successful conclusion, is Costa Rican, because she had tremendous support back home. And that's essentially our DNA. You can't change that DNA. And I recall one evening when the negotiations were happening in Paris, there was a message, literally a message, that was shining on the Eiffel Tower. And it was the Costa Rican seal from our flag. And it said, Costa Rica, 100% possible, based on we had, essentially achieved virtually 100% renewable electricity. But in other areas as well. I mean, there was literally the message, but the message is obviously much more virtual. But if a country can show that something is possible, it's like when someone breaks a record in the Olympics. Suddenly, everyone knows it's possible, and then everyone starts breaking the same record. So it's very important to have these examples. And in a country where the scale allows you to implement certain things as a model, that is, I think, what we can most contribute to the global agreement.
The questions for the audience, and the approach we'd like to take is we'll maybe take 3 questions from 3 different individuals, and then the panelists can articulate their response from that.
Good morning. My name is Kim Weichel. I'm on the board of UNA-NCA. So thank you both. I am thrilled to learn about your interagency multi-stakeholder council. I think that's terrific to engage and very important to engage NGOs, faith-based, as well as the private sector. But my biggest concern, or one of my big concerns in full implementation of the SDGs, is financing them, paying for them, which of course is also prioritizing them. And so it sounds like Costa Rica maybe has this handled, but I'm wondering how you both really dealt with this in your countries, and more importantly, what advice you would give to many countries for whom financing these SDGs is a big uphill battle.
Hi, Tony Pipa, and thanks both for your remarks and for your continued leadership on the SDGs. And Ambassador Hart, you talked about U.S. leadership, and I think at least until 2020, we won't have a great deal of U.S. federal leadership, and yet the whole of society approach that we talk about with the SDGs really has, I think, started to take hold and have a lot of traction. And so while we might not have leadership from the central federal government, I think there's a lot of leadership in other areas. So it'd be interesting to hear what that impact, what that looks like from the global perspective, and what advice you might have for those who are trying to really push progress of the SDGs from different sectors, and even from the subnational level, from state governments and city governments, but businesses, universities like Georgetown, those who actually have global influence and have really embraced this particular agenda, and yet probably won't have a partner from the White House in sort of taking this forward. It'd be good to hear your reflections and how that, what's possible, and how you might provide some guidance to those who are working.
Hi, my name is Lori Brown. I'm with the American Chemical Society, and I'd specifically like to know what mechanisms your countries have in place for connecting with U.S.-based NGOs such as ourselves, specifically scientific-based NGOs, or what advice you might have for organizations such as ourselves for getting involved with helping to achieve the SDGs, perhaps in partnerships with organizations within your countries. Thank you.
how you prioritize and finance, a question related to how things work across levels of government, as well as the interconnection with civil society and NGOs.
I guess I'll go first. And the financing question is one of the most significant issues related to implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Reality is that successful implementation of the SDGs will depend heavily on sustained and predictable sources of finance. There is the coming from developing country to call, there is this sort of reflex action that we call for increased official development assistance. That will play a role, yes. However, I believe that resources from countries themselves, countries making the necessary investments themselves, will make the difference. The case of my own country, we've had free primary, secondary, and tertiary education in place since the 1960s. We've also had universal healthcare. Now, as we've progressed over the course of the last 50 years, it is now apparent that we need to make changes to the provision of free education, primarily at the tertiary level, and we also need to make changes to how we have universal or grant universal access to all of our citizens, because it is becoming or it has become extremely costly at a time when government has some fiscal difficulties. But the underlying principle will remain in place, even if citizens of the country now have to, as individuals, undertake part of the costs of, say, tertiary education or healthcare. So these financing issues are not unique to countries like a country like Barbados. There are some of the same issues that you're dealing with here in the United States and in other countries as well. However, I believe that successful implementation will depend on how we can involve the private sector more in financing some of the attainment of some of these goals. For example, around energy, using energy as an example. The cost of energy in the Caribbean is approximately 3 times higher than it is in the United States. It costs about, on average, about 30 cents per kilowatt hour to generate electricity in the Caribbean. Not to generate, but in terms of the cost that consumers pay for electricity. We have recognized that moving towards renewable energy will significantly reduce those costs and improve the competitiveness of businesses in the region, and will also result in more disposable income for households who are currently faced with higher electricity costs. So, but who bears the cost of moving towards renewable energy, primarily wind and solar, and in some of the other islands of the Caribbean, geothermal energy? Some of those upfront costs will need to come from governments and from the international community, the international development banks. However, the majority of those costs, because there's a clear business case, very clear business case for private sector involvement in the energy sector. We're small countries, however, there's still a very clear business case for private sector involvement in the energy sector in the region. And we've seen this in Barbados, simply by changing the legislation, changing the legislation around the Electricity Act in Barbados to make provisions for independent power producers, putting in place a regulatory regime to ensure that there's certainty in terms of the electricity being sold back into the grid. That has resulted in the growth of the solar and wind sector in my country. By the end of this year, about 25 to 30% of our electricity will be generated from wind and solar. And projections are that by 2029, 2030, close to 100% will be generated from wind and solar and waste to energy. So it did not result in any massive expenditure on the part of government. It simply resulted in creating an enabling environment at the domestic level, making the necessary regulatory and policy shifts in order to support private sector investment and private sector involvement. And in many of the SDGs, which are sometimes seen as social, I believe that that represents a good model. Now, there will be some goals that will require direct investments on the part of governments, but I believe on many of these goals, the private sector can play private sector finance can play an important role. And very briefly, I fully agree with Tony's point on U.S. leadership. It might not come, but we're still hopeful. I don't think that we should give up trying to convince the federal government to be more involved by making a very strong case. It is in the U.S.'s national interest to support implementation of the SDGs. It is in the national security interest of the United States to ensure that diseases, that poverty, many of the threats and challenges on the global stage are significantly reduced in line with some of the goals contained in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The reality is that our world is interconnected. Our world is interconnected. So as we saw with Ebola, for example, it's extremely difficult for any one country to wall themselves off from the international community. So this interconnected world means that threats, challenges, but also opportunities can easily spill across borders. So I've not yet given up hope. But what is taking place at the subnational level is absolutely amazing. And we saw this with both the SDGs and the climate processes in 2015. In 2015, I was based in the office of the UN Secretary General. I was heading his climate team. So we had a Costa Rican in Bonn, and we had a Barbadian in New York who were both playing really important roles in bringing this global agreement together. And there was a massive, one of the most important game changers was that climate summit that climate summit and the climate march in September 2014. In September 2014, Ban Ki-moon decided to have a climate summit, which for the first time brought political leaders, business leaders, leaders of civil society, faith-based leaders, everyone together in the same room to make firm commitments on advancing progress towards Paris. On the Sunday before that climate summit, there was a march through the city of New York, where for the very first time you had hundreds and thousands of individuals across the political divide, nationalities, various groups marching together. And virtually every single leader made reference to that climate march. And that climate march and the climate summit, what it did was that it fortified the political will of leaders to take bold and ambitious action. Right? It helped them to see that they had strong domestic political support for taking climate action. And I believe that if there's a groundswell of support at the subnational level among U.S. businesses and at the local level, individual people in schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, supporting the sustainable development goals, I believe politicians, politicians love to jump on a bandwagon, whether they're politicians in Barbados, Costa Rica, or the United States. They love, in democracies, they love, I'm not a politician, so I can say that, but they love to jump on a bandwagon. And I think if you can build, and this goes to the question on the NGOs, if you're able to build that grassroots solidarity and support around the SDGs, I think it can be helpful.
Ambassador Macaya, we'll give you the last word here, and then we're going to take a brief break for coffee, and then we'll reconvene.
Okay, I'll address the first question, which was on the financing. And my prior remark in that it's good to get to the point where it's only financing, and you have the political consensus is where you want to be. But that doesn't mean that financing is not an issue. I mean, we have to come up with the financing. Now, a lot of it is setting priorities and coordinating institutions so that there's alignment among institutions. And I'll give one example from our cabinet in Costa Rica. The Minister of the Environment in Costa Rica is the Minister of Energy. So it's called the Ministry of Environment and Energy. Those are two ministries which, if separate, would probably clash. You'd have a Minister of Energy thinking, well, I've got a plan for the next decade of power that has to be provided to our citizens. We're going to build all these coal power plants. And then you have the Ministry of the Environment thinking, well, how do I mitigate all these emissions and how do I get the budget to reconvert to a greener type of energy? Well, when it's the same person, and it might be an institutional quirk in our history that our Minister of the Environment is the Minister of Energy, that same person who's planning ahead for power generation has to also make sure that that power is generated in an environmentally sustainable manner. So then the issue of cost comes up. Okay, are we willing as a society to pay a slightly higher price for electricity if it's renewable? And that's where the consensus comes in. Essentially that's your financing, is what's going to be the cost of that power. And so it's achieving that consensus, it's institutional alignment, and getting everyone on the same page. We have, for example, for many years, measured poverty based strictly on income. And this administration changed the approach. We call it a multi-dimensional approach to poverty. And that is, okay, we're a middle-income country. What does that mean for a person? Does that person have access to the levels of consumption, to energy, to education, to healthcare, and so forth, regardless of their level of income? And so we've taken that new approach, and we actually go out and approach different communities, lower access communities, to make sure that the people that need access to certain services have it, regardless of their level of income. So once again, it's coordination. I mean, we all have to operate as a government, but governments have to have a budget. We're already spending money. So how do we spend it in a way that's most consistent to aligning these, the achievement of these 17 big goals? And our Ministry of Planning has taken that sort of that translational approach, is, to make sure that all the ministries involved in government are operating towards a single goal and coordinating budgets. And I would say that goes to the point of this happens regardless of what other countries are doing. I mean, we believe in this, and we certainly hope that the rest of the world does as well. but we have to follow our aspirations, and I would say, as a scientist, we should also follow the science. Go to where the science takes you. If you want to achieve a reduction in extreme weather, well, what does science say, and what's the best way to approach that? Whether it's water issues, whether it's biodiversity, and so forth. And getting to the final point on how to engage NGOs like the American Chemical Society, which I have been a member of, by the way, please approach our embassy. We have given science diplomacy a very high priority, and it's been a very productive agenda in achieving partnerships between academics, private labs or private groups, governments, to work on science issues or science-based problems and challenges together. And we have a number of examples to prove how productive this agenda has been. So we welcome any NGO to approach our embassy, and we will look for the relevant stakeholders back home that would be your counterpart.
Ambassador Macaya, Ambassador Hart, thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, ambassadors, and thank you, Professor Giordano, for moderating. We'll go into a brief 5-minute coffee break before the next panel begins.